Imagine you're 16 years old. You get into a fight, it escalates. You end up charged with first-degree assault. Now, depending entirely on what state you live in, one of two things happens. In one state, your case starts in juvenile court. You have access to counseling, rehabilitation programs, and a judge whose entire job is focused on turning your life around. Your record can be sealed, your future is not over. In another state, that same charge automatically sends you to adult court. You are processed alongside adults. You could serve time in an adult facility. That conviction follows you forever on job applications, housing applications, college applications. At 16, same charge, two completely different futures. Here is the part that should make everyone stop and think. The state that sends you to adult court is actually more likely to see you commit another crime. That is not a theory. That is the conclusion of 6 separate studies funded by the U.S. Department of Justice. So why are we still doing this? And why did 2 states just pass brand new laws this month going in completely opposite directions? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand the full picture, including the $870 million one state just committed to an approach the research says makes things worse, and the racial disparity numbers that should be in every headline but aren't. Here is what we are covering today, and I need you to stay for all of it because the pieces connect. We're going to look at how many kids are actually being sent to adult court and what has changed over the last 25 years. Then we're going to walk through what the research actually says happens to those kids, because the data is not what most people expect. Then we're going to break down 2 laws signed within the last 30 days, one in Maryland, one in Missouri, that went in completely opposite directions. And we're going to talk about the numbers on racial disparity that most politicians skip right over. Everything in this video is sourced. Sources are in the description. Let's get into it. Let's start with scale, because most people have no idea how many kids we're actually talking about. At the turn of the 21st century, approximately 250,000 children per year were being charged as adults in the United States. That is not a typo. 250,000 kids every single year processed through the adult criminal system. By 2019, that number had dropped 80%, down to about 53,000. That is real progress driven by 2 decades of reform legislation. But 53,000 kids a year is still 53,000 families whose children are navigating a system built for adults. As of 2023, 2,000 people under 18 were sitting in adult jails. 513 were serving sentences in adult prisons. That represents an 83% drop from the 1997 peak, but those are still real children.
Now, how does a kid actually end up in adult court? There are 3 routes, but here's the simplest way to understand it. Sometimes a judge decides. Sometimes the law decides automatically based on the charge. And in some states, the prosecutor decides, alone, with no judicial review required. That last one matters. In states with prosecutorial direct file, a single decision by a single prosecutor can send a child into the adult system before any judge has reviewed the case. No hearing, no weighing of the individual circumstances. One person's call. Now, here is the question most people ask at this point. Okay, but if the crime is serious enough, shouldn't the punishment match? Fair question, and the answer depends entirely on what you think punishment is supposed to accomplish. If the goal is accountability, making sure there are consequences, the juvenile system has that. Commitment programs, detention facilities, structured supervision. Consequences exist. If the goal is reducing the chance they ever hurt someone again, then the adult system has a documented track record of making that outcome worse. Let's look at the data. 6 large-scale studies reviewed by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention all reached the same conclusion. Transferring youth to adult court does not deter crime. It does not reduce reoffending. It produces the opposite result. Here are the specific numbers. A Florida study tracked youth after their cases were resolved. Among kids transferred to adult court, 30% were rearrested within 1 year. Among comparable kids who stayed in juvenile court for the same types of offenses, 19%. That is not a small gap. That is 11 percentage points of additional crime being produced by the approach that is supposed to be tougher. Multi-state research across New York, Pennsylvania, and Florida found youth who served time in adult prisons had recidivism rates nearly 30% higher than those who went through the juvenile system. And researchers went further. They controlled for selection bias, meaning they accounted for the fact that adult court often handles more serious cases. Even with that adjustment, the findings held. Youth in adult court came out worse. The overall rearrest rate for juvenile offenders within 2 to 3 years sits between 70 and 80% regardless of system. But the adult system pushes that number up, not down. So why does this happen? Because the adult system was not built to rehabilitate, it was built to punish. When a developing brain, and a 16-year-old brain is still actively developing, that is neuroscience, not opinion, goes into an environment built around punishment with no therapeutic infrastructure, the outcomes reflect that. The juvenile system at its best is built differently. Treatment, education, mental health services, structured reentry. The research shows that environment produces better long-term public safety outcomes. That is not soft, that is just what the data says.
Before we get into the 2 new laws, I want to hear from you directly. Do you think juveniles should ever be tried as adults? Drop your answer in the comments. Yes, no, or it depends. And tell me what would change your mind. I read every comment on this channel. Now let's get into what just happened in the law. On May 26, 2026, 4 days ago, Maryland Governor Wes Moore signed the Youth Charging Reform Act into law. Here is what it actually does, in plain terms. Before this law, a 16-year-old in Maryland charged with first-degree assault was automatically sent to adult court. No judge weighing the individual circumstances. Automatic. After this law takes effect on October 1st, that same 16-year-old starts in juvenile court. A judge reviews the case. The system can evaluate the individual, their background, their circumstances, whether they are a public safety risk, before deciding whether adult court is appropriate. The law raises the age for automatic adult charging from 14 to 16. It covers first-degree assault, gun possession, robbery, kidnapping, and a range of other offenses. The carve-outs, 14 and 15-year-olds charged with first-degree murder or rape still go directly to adult court. That exception remains. The law also bans placing youth charged as adults in adult prisons, with only a narrow 6-hour exception for intake processing. Context on why that provision matters. Being housed with adult offenders is one of the documented risk factors for increased recidivism in transferred youth. It is not just the court process, it is what happens inside the facility. Maryland also looked at the raw numbers before passing this. Over 1,000 kids were charged as adults in Maryland in just the last reported year. This law directly changes that pipeline starting this fall. Now here's where it gets complicated, because 1 month before Maryland moved in that direction, Missouri moved in the exact opposite direction. And this is the $870 million number I mentioned at the top. In April 2026, Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe signed a law that expands the pipeline into adult court rather than restricting it. Here's what Missouri's law does. Previously, only a juvenile officer or the court could request a hearing to certify a youth for adult court. Missouri's new law gives prosecutors the power to initiate that process themselves, with full access to the juvenile's complete records. A minor who commits 3 distinct felonies within 180 days now qualifies to be tried as an adult, full stop. All juvenile records and fingerprints must now be submitted to the state's criminal history database, accessible to law enforcement, prosecutors, and courts going forward. And the law increases mandatory minimum prison percentages before parole eligibility. The fiscal estimate attached to this legislation, $870 million by fiscal year 2029, primarily from increased incarceration costs. To be direct about what that means, Missouri is projecting to spend nearly $1 billion on an expansion of the approach that 6 federally funded research studies have found produces higher rates of reoffending. That is not a criticism. That is the documented tension between the research and the political pressure lawmakers face when constituents want accountability after violent crimes. But both facts are true at the same time, and voters in Missouri deserve to know both. Now here is the part that does not get enough airtime.
Because everything we have talked about so far does not fall equally on all kids. Black youth make up 16% of the total youth population in the United States. They represent 32% of all juvenile arrests, 36% of juvenile court cases, 40% of incarcerated youth. And when it comes specifically to being sent to adult court, Black youth are transferred 6 times more often than white youth for comparable offenses. Not similar offense types, comparable. Same charge categories, similar circumstances, 6 times more likely to end up in adult court. In Florida, Black boys make up 27.2% of youth who are arrested. They make up more than half of all youth transferred to adult court. The Sentencing Project found Black youth are 9 times more likely to receive an adult prison sentence compared to similar white youth. As of 2021, Black youth were 4.7 times as likely to be placed in a juvenile facility as white peers, and that disparity widens once the adult system enters the equation. These numbers are not from one study or one state. They are a consistent pattern across decades, across jurisdictions, and across every level of the juvenile justice system. Any conversation about reforming how we charge youth as adults that does not include these numbers is not a complete conversation. Let's close with the financial reality, because this is the argument that cuts across political lines. Georgia spends $217,517 per year to incarcerate a single child in its system. The 3-year recidivism rate after that investment? 35.1%. Missouri just committed an estimated $870 million to expand that same pipeline. Community-based alternatives, diversion programs, mental health treatment, restorative justice cost a fraction of incarceration and consistently outperform it in recidivism outcomes. The National Institute of Justice is actively funding new research on this right now in 2026 because the gap in community options is one of the documented reasons youth end up institutionalized in the first place, not because they need it, because nothing else exists. Remember the scenario I opened with? A 16-year-old, first-degree assault charge, 2 states, 2 completely different outcomes. Maryland just decided to route that kid through a system built to rehabilitate. Missouri just decided to make it easier to route that kid through a system built to punish. The research says one of those decisions will produce better public safety outcomes. What happens in those 2 states over the next 5 years will be one of the most important natural experiments in juvenile justice policy in recent memory, and we will be watching it here. If you are still watching right now, you are the audience this channel is built for. Subscribe so you are here when the follow-up comes. Drop your take in the comments. Should any juvenile ever be tried as an adult? And if yes, where do you draw the line? I will see you in the next one.